Last year, a video of fair inspectors forcibly detaining a young black man went viral. It's a difficult video to watch.
Let me go! Let me get off!
No, you're under arrest.
Let me go!
You're under arrest.
I didn't do anything! Okay, let me go! You're hurting me! You're hurting me!
So what happened here? Well, the story begins when the young man, Reese Maxwell Crawford, boards a streetcar. Crawford stands across from a fair inspector who had just finished his shift. At some point, the fair inspector and two of his colleagues depart the streetcar and stand outside. Then one of the inspectors smiles at Reese and Reese opens the door. The inspector pushes Reese and Reese fights back. He ends up getting pinned and detained. So why did the fair inspector shove Reese, seemingly out of nowhere? Well, the TTC did an investigation to try to figure this out. The investigation found it was reasonable and justified for the inspector to push Crawford. They said the only unprofessional thing the inspector did was smile at Crawford. If that conclusion seems unlikely, you're not the only person who thinks that. The city ombudsman audited the TTC's investigation and found it fell short. Here are some examples. In the TTC investigation, the inspector said Crawford appeared emotionally disturbed. He claimed Crawford was trying to intimidate him with a dead stare. Crawford claims to have been listening to music on his headphones. He said he was zoning out. The inspector told the TTC that Crawford had headphones around his neck, but video evidence never shows Crawford with headphones around his neck. The inspector said Crawford spent a long period of time staring him down before the inspector tried to talk to Crawford. But video evidence shows the inspector talking to Crawford within 2 seconds of Crawford boarding. The investigation doesn't address this discrepancy. The inspectors claimed Crawford clenched his fists and put his hands in his pockets. One inspector worried Crawford might have a weapon. Video evidence never shows Reese clenching his fists or putting his hands in his pocket. You can kind of feel how the inspector might have been building a narrative about Crawford here that doesn't really match reality. The TTC said this incident wasn't race-related, but this is exactly what racial profiling means. In Ontario, racial profiling doesn't have to be conscious. Racial profiling includes people who are well-meaning and not overtly biased. You can racially profile and not explicitly be setting out to do it. Now, more than a year later, 2 of the fair inspectors remain at the TTC. The other fair inspector quit his job, but for unrelated reasons. He wasn't fired. The point I'm trying to make here is that the TTC investigation fell short, which should maybe not surprise us because the TTC investigated itself. Organizations don't typically investigate themselves. Imagine the police investigating themselves or the CRA letting taxpayers audit themselves. It wouldn't work. That's not real oversight. This is what led councillor Gord Perks to put forward this motion in July of this year.
I move that Toronto City Council inform the Toronto Transit Commission Board that the City Council will not fund any transit enforcement officers in the 2020 budget.
Perks' motion has been widely misunderstood, in part because this is a complicated issue, but also in part because of publications like BlogTO that ran headlines like, "Toronto might eliminate controversial TTC fair inspectors," which is wrong. To know why the headline is wrong, you have to understand that there are 2 types of TTC officers: fair inspectors and transit enforcement officers. Fair inspectors inspect rider proof of payment and can issue tickets. They are not special constables and they don't carry weapons. Enforcement officers carry handcuffs, pepper spray, and batons. Enforcement officers act like police and have powers similar to police. Perks is fine with fair inspectors. It's the enforcement officers he wants to get rid of. So BlogTO's headline, it's not just kind of incorrect, it's totally false. It should actually read something like this. Perks wants to get rid of enforcement officers because he's heard too many stories like Crawford's where the TTC does a poor job of self-investigating. Until the TTC has proper oversight like our police officers do, Perks thinks that they should not have enforcement officers that get to act like police officers. I met with him at City Hall to talk more.
There's a very important piece of nuance here. The professional body that oversees the police is an investigative body. The ombudsman is not an investigator. They don't have those powers. They're not investigating the incident. What they are doing is reviewing how well the TTC performed in their investigation.
What Perks is pointing out is that even though the city ombudsman audits the TTC's investigations, that's not actual real oversight. All the ombudsman does is make recommendations, which the TTC usually promises to enact, but sometimes doesn't. Like in 2015 when this incident went viral.
The video was shot in January by transit riders heading to the subway after a Toronto Maple Leafs game. The images are clear, up close, violent.
Let's go! Hey, stop!
After this incident, the ombudsman made a series of recommendations. The TTC promised to enact them by the end of the year, but they never did. And why would they? They don't need to. The ombudsman is not an investigator, it just makes recommendations. The TTC has no legal obligation to do what they recommend. This lack of oversight is not a new issue. Back in 2010, Toronto's police chief actually refused to sign off on enforcement officers, then called special constables. He refused to sign off on them because they had taken to executing search warrants and driving emergency vehicles with flashing red lights. Here's what the police board chair had to say at the time. There are limits to what special constables can do, and it is dangerous to create an impression that they have the powers of a police officer. So the TTC was without special constables for 2 years, but then eventually they got them back. So here's the pattern. Every few years, something controversial happens with the TTC, and council has to deal with it again. And it always means the same thing.
It just means that council gets to tell the TTC for the umpteenth time, you have to do a better job of this.
Council never seems to discuss the underlying structural problem. The TTC has enforcement officers with police-like powers, but without the oversight of police. Some councillors don't seem to understand that this is an oversight problem.
And will it happen again? It may, but we have the process to deal with it.
Other councillors suggest this will all be fine if the TTC just enacts the ombudsman's recommendations, despite the TTC's history of making promises and not following through.
These are really important recommendations that we have to move forward on, that we are moving forward on, that are going to make the TTC a safer and more accessible system.
Mayor Tory acknowledges that while things might not have worked in the past, he has a sense things are different with Rick Leary, the TTC CEO.
I myself have confidence from having spent so much time with Mr. Leary that he, whatever may be said about previous leaders that have failed, I wasn't here for those people, but I will say I think he is very genuine in his desire to fix this.
These debates are stupid. I don't deny Rick Leary is a genuine guy. I don't know him. He probably is a genuine guy. My guess is the people running the TTC are good, honest people trying to do the best they can. The problem isn't people, it's the system of oversight. An honest debate about enforcement officers has to begin by acknowledging that enforcement officers live in a gray area. They have the powers of the police without the same oversight. So I don't actually know if we should get rid of enforcement officers, but what I learned from researching this video is that the debate is complicated, which leads to politicians offering easy but disingenuous answers. If we don't at least acknowledge that the TTC has an oversight problem, we're just going to repeat the same empty debate every couple of years when the TTC investigates itself and we discover they didn't do a great job. So for my next video, I want to explore fare evasion. I think fare evasion is the reason the TTC is so intent on keeping enforcement officers. The TTC lost a headline-grabbing $60 million in fare evasion in 2018. Which the media loves to point out, and this creates pressure on the TTC to reduce fare evasion, whether it's realistic or not. Enforcement officers are often seen as the solution to fare evasion. But there's something inevitable about fare evasion. Almost every other modern transit system deals with it. So my next video is going to explore fare evasion. Subscribe to my channel to hear when it's released. I also wanted to let you know about my weekly email newsletter. It tells you everything you need to know about the week in Toronto. Political news, hidden gems, restaurant openings, and just anything interesting. You can find a link to it in the video description below. Thanks for watching.